The NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1050 Ti was once one of the most popular and cost-effective graphics cards available. However, nearly 8 years after the release of this budget Pascal card, it is beginning to show its age and limitations. Today, I want to explore the performance you can expect from this legendary gaming GPU in a variety of titles. Released in October 2016, the GTX 1050 Ti occupied the lower middle end of the market at the time. Performance-wise, it fit into NVIDIA's Pascal lineup ahead of the GTX 1050 non-Ti and just behind the very popular GTX 1060. With an MSRP of $139 US, the 1050 Ti quickly became a favorite among individuals seeking a power-efficient performer capable of handling 1080p gaming in that era's games. Based on the Pascal architecture, the 1050 Ti uses the GP107 graphics processor and is built with a 14nm process. The reference GPU features a base clock of 1291 MHz, a boost clock of 1392 MHz, and a memory clock of 1752 MHz. For its render configuration, the 1050 Ti includes 768 shading units, 48 TMUs, and 32 ROPs. It comes with 4GB of GDDR5 video memory running on a 128-bit bus width. With native support for both DX12 and Vulkan, the GTX 1050 Ti is an efficient card with a TDP of just 75 watts and a recommended power supply wattage of 250 watts. The specific card I will be testing in today's video is the MSI GTX 1050 Ti Gaming X variant. I acquired this particular card in a recent parts haul that I featured on the channel. My card has a 5% overclock to the clock speeds, and sports the typical video outputs including one DVI port, an HDMI 2.0 port, and a DisplayPort 1.4 port. As of June 2024, the average used price of the GTX 1050 Ti is around $60 to $70 US, based on what I have seen locally and on sites like eBay. Before we even look at in-game performance, it's pretty easy to conclude that the GTX 1050 Ti doesn't offer great value in 2024. This is primarily because graphics cards like the 6GB GTX 1060 and the RX 580 8GB exist and are available at similar price points while providing more performance and more VRAM. Additionally, older GPUs like the GTX 1070 and GTX 1660 Super can often be found for around $100 and will perform significantly better in modern titles. With that being said, if you own a GTX 1050 Ti or manage to get a great deal on one like I did, you can likely expect light 1080p gaming with mostly low settings and a lot of resolution scaling based on its specs. For today's testing, I will be running the GTX 1050 Ti in my GPU test bench, which includes a Ryzen 5 5600X, 32GB of DDR4 RAM running at 3600 MHz. Windows 10 and all games will be running on a Gen 3 NVMe drive. Also, to maximize the 1050 Ti's in-game performance, I will be using a capture card for on-screen recording. In the games tested, I generally stick to presets rather than optimizing each specific setting. This approach keeps things simple and provides a reference for what the card is capable of. Starting off with some esports titles, I ran Counter-Strike 2 at 1080p using the medium preset. After a few practice bot matches on Dust 2, I experienced a consistent average of 170 FPS with solid percentile lows and no noticeable stutters. Overall, this was a great high refresh rate output for CS2. In the Rainbow Six Siege benchmarking tool at the medium settings, the results were very similar to CS2. The average FPS came in at 178, and the percentile figures were both over 100 FPS. Fortnite, which is a bit more resource intensive, still performed well on the GTX 1050 Ti. In DX11 at the medium quality preset with view distance set to far, the 1050 Ti achieved an average of just over 100 FPS during the long match. There were the typical dips and drops that Fortnite tends to have, even on high-end systems, but overall the performance was solid. Next up, I ran GTA 5, which remains a staple test game until it loses popularity or GTA 6 is finally released. At very high settings across the board, the GTX 1050 Ti averaged around 50 FPS, with percentile lows over 30 FPS. The settings were pretty cranked up, pushing the GPU a bit, but achieving a solid 50 FPS for a budget card at 1080p at these settings is pretty commendable. Cyberpunk 2077 with the low preset and FSR set to quality ran okay, offering a playable output. After driving around Night City for a while, I got an average of 38 FPS with percentile lows around 30. At FSR quality, the visuals still look passable and don't significantly detract from the immersion, in my opinion. The next game I tested was Assassin's Creed Mirage, which was set to the low preset with the upsampling setting set to balanced. In the built-in benchmarking tool, the GTX 1050 Ti gave me a result of 43 FPS, which is pretty decent for a 2023 release. In another newer title, Hogwarts Legacy, I ran it at 1080p low preset with FSR quality. The GTX 1050 Ti provided a stable frame rate, averaging in the mid-40s across the map, including the castle, flying around, and in Hogsmeade Village at night. Baldur's Gate 3 at the low settings and FSR quality also performed adequately. In the city, I was getting around 50 FPS in most cases, though there were some stutters while rendering new areas. Personally, I find it pretty challenging to play Baldur's Gate 3 at lower resolutions or with FSR due to how zoomed out and small everything appears, especially during combat. However, for someone who can overlook the poorly rendered textures, this sort of gameplay is pretty fine. Lastly, I ran Horizon Forbidden West at the low preset and FSR quality once again. The graphical fidelity took a significant hit, and some individuals might find this borderline unplayable, especially in fast-paced combat scenarios. The overall graininess of the image was also pretty hard to look at times. Although the GTX 1050 Ti falls below the minimum recommended specs for this game, it might still provide an enjoyable experience for someone with pretty low expectations. After experiencing how the GTX 1050 Ti handles these games, I can confidently say that it falls below the threshold of a GPU I could recommend to someone on a budget. Even before considering some better options like I mentioned earlier, the need for low settings and FSR upscaling in most AAA titles means that the viability of running games at a playable frame rate in the near future is questionable. That being said, if you already have a GTX 1050 Ti or you can get one for cheap, the GPU should ideally be used for older titles, emulation, or as an esports card. It can also suffice for a few modern and intensive titles if you're willing to significantly drop the settings and can tolerate very low graphical fidelity. If you want to see more reviews of older budget PC components or some used gaming PC flips, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Also, leave a comment about your experiences with the GTX 1050 Ti if you have any, or share any questions or video suggestions that you may have. Thank you.